Hi, my name's Peter Parsons. I'm a solution architect at Progress Chef, and today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jay Thoden van Velzen, who is from SAP, and is going to talk to us about how SAP does compliance at scale. Jay, over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for attending this session. I hope everybody's had a fantastic conference. I'm certainly looking forward to all of the sessions that we're having this time again. So you may remember me from last year. I'm very happy to be speaking again. We have been doing some really cool stuff. And while last time we talked mostly about the trajectory towards go live, we actually went live and have some really interesting stories to tell, at least we think so. So my name is Jay. I'm part of the SEC Devops team in SAP in the Multicloud group. SAP is always a funny one because it's sort of the software company that nobody has ever heard of, but it's actually the number 3 or sometimes number 2 software company globally with around 107,000 employees. And we started off really as making software that people ran on-premise, but increasingly that's offered also as SaaS and PaaS solutions. And that's where our group really comes in when it comes to public cloud. And we've been growing very rapidly. So first dip into public cloud infrastructure was roughly around 2015 or so. And we pretty much doubled our use of public cloud resources every year since. So it's been pretty much quadratic. And interestingly enough, just recently, we were named as the number 2 in the Cloud Wars for Q2 of this year as hottest cloud vendors. And, it's kind of funny for SAP to be called the hottest cloud. We're not usually the most flashy ones, although we have a really interesting campaign now as SAP as the coolest software company that you've never heard of before. And I actually kind of agree because we do really interesting stuff. Like SAP sort of makes the software that makes businesses run. So like supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, getting something from a factory in China onto a boat, into a port somewhere, and then across a rail network into distribution centers and into shops. That's probably a lot of SAP systems involved there. And there's something kind of uniquely exciting, I think, about like doing security for that kind of software. So we're multi-cloud a priori. That was done initially for business reasons. SAP has this long-term idea of customers pick winners, not SAP. So we were always going to cover multiple cloud providers to be able to offer the preference of our individual customers. And we call that 4+1. The +1 is a cloud that SAP runs itself in its own data centers. And the 4 refer to the global 3, AWS, Azure, and GCP. The 4th is then Alibaba, but we also run on AWS China and Azure China, and they are both significantly different to the point that we treat them really as number 5 and 6, because technically and operationally, you have to approach them differently. And the multi-cloud team provides a central government. So we're the interface between cloud providers and business units or lines of businesses, as we call them, within the organization. So we provide central chargeback and cost optimization. So billing flows through us, but also infrastructure services. And then specifically of interest to me is like the security services together with our partners in network and security architecture. That's the Seg Devops team. That's the more operational side of stuff that gets us to play with this really large landscape of, at the moment, 13,500 cloud accounts. And if you remember from last year, I think we talked about 11,000 at the time. And it sounds like, oh, maybe the growth went out, but there was actually a cleanup period in February where 2,500 cloud accounts that weren't being used were removed. So it's actually an increase of around 5,000 over the last time that we were here. Running around 150,000 VMs. That number is actually a little bit static because much of it is now moving into Kubernetes and container-based deployments. And to give a further sense of the size, especially because we have to scan these things, is that we have around 1.5 million storage and network assets each. So, all kinds of VPCs, subnets, routing tables, storage buckets, and disk volumes. And then when it comes to users and roles, we're now like over 5 million IAM assets and roles. And of course, a lot of that is in AWS because of the way that works. What makes this technically really interesting is that, this kind of makes us a unicorn in cloud use. We were actually, this is based on, the variety of our workloads, the size and the continued growth rate. One of those cloud providers actually told us that we were unique in their customer base. And, we're a software company ourselves. And that's not actually something, is on the one hand, it makes you go like, huh, we're unique. But on the other hand, it's like, that's not the most comfortable position to be in. So it does mean that we often have to figure out things for ourselves. That's even more significant because the amount of regulations, audit requirements that we have to take care of, not just maybe the obvious ones like ISO and SOC or PCI, though that's relatively rare, but there's different country regulations. There's of course GDPR in Europe, but there's special cases in Brazil, the Middle East, Australia, China. So what SAP tries to do through our SAP Global Security Defensive Architecture team is provide a security policy framework that abstracts that stuff out so that there's one policy that covers most of the use cases. And therefore will look very similar to everybody else's policy, but maybe slightly different. We have exception processes in place in case there's somebody with an outlier request. That happens from time to time. But the security policy framework is really what everybody in the company is supposed to adhere to. And that leads to policies in different areas. So there's for OS hardening, for the way you configure networks. And there's specific policies as well for public cloud landscapes on a high level. So, sort of general principles, but also specific hardening procedures for AWS, Azure, GCP, and Ali Cloud, because each one of them is a little bit different. Things are called a bit different. It seems almost, deliberately sometimes chosen that way. So that's something else than what the competitors use, but also their architecture is different from one to the next. And what we then want to do is run compliance scans to make sure that we actually see what the landscape looks like in the deploy. So obviously there's a lot of stuff that happens in the development lifecycle as well to make sure that what goes in is okay. But, if you have this much stuff runs through the cracks, so to make sure that everybody is actually, on their toes, we run compliance scans to make sure that we understand how do teams meet these policy requirements. And then subsequently, we enriched that data with account ownership and organizational hierarchy, as well as some other security attributes to make it more meaningful to the teams in the organization. That really drives our remediation and policy enforcement. A lot of it is on our side is really around enabling that to happen. So we have multiple ways to bring these scanning results through the different teams, and that's not just developer teams that build customer-facing products, but also all kinds of internal use, internal IT, demo system, sandboxes, and labs that people have throughout the company, so that we make sure that people receive the scan results, but also that we can track the status of compliance throughout the entire organization, and make sure that there's support structures in place for teams to meet those compliance goals. We'll talk about a lot of that more later in the deck. This is like a little bit, the first two columns are sort of the summary of my presentation from last ChefConf. We first learned about Chef in Spec in the summer of 2019, when the team was still quite small, and it looked kind of attractive, but a bit of a crazy idea perhaps. And then around the August timeframe, kicked off a bunch of security remediation programs that led to planning in October of that year or November of that year towards, where could we make significant improvements. And Chef in Spec came up by, probably in this crowd, fairly famous GCP employee and former Chef employee. And that made us look again at the product, and especially the compliance as code idea really appealed. We had a good guy on the team, Tim Jones, he's since moved on, was fairly confident that we could containerize it and build it make it accessible both to developer teams themselves, but also run global compliance scans. And started talking with Chef in February of 2020. That was actually our last in-person trip. And initially we thought, okay, we'll use it for a relatively small use case around our preventive controls, especially so that people could test early and not get affected by them. We ended up, as we had already made the commitment, in a situation where our existing commercial CSPM solution increasingly gave us problems, while we were very happy with how it was going with InSpec. And for a variety of reasons, came to a conclude, or at least a point where we had to make a decision. So could Chef maybe cover the entire use case for CSPM? And there were significantly attractive points of why that at least should be considered. But of course, it was also a rather big commitment to do that, to cover the entire policy set and all the landscape, when that is a quite large responsibility, especially when you know that the landscape is going to be doubling for the foreseeable future. So kind of gambling a little bit the entire compliance posture of the company on that. We deployed it on GKE for scale and ran a series of scalability tests. And if you remember from last year, we ran the test, but we didn't tell Chef because there wasn't any issue that we found. And on Monday morning, they asked, like, did you run the test? Did you delay it? And it's like, oh, actually, no, it went well. And it turned out that there were a whole bunch of people on standby, but everybody was super relieved that that it worked out. And we told most of those stories last year on 2021, and then we came back. Okay, it was virtual, but that was done, and we thought that we were still scanning in about 3 hours, and that turned out to be 12. And suddenly we had to go through a rather significant scalability and optimization efforts. And Justin and Rohit will talk much more about that in their session tomorrow, because there's a lot of fantastic stories around that. But we got through that, and we actually released the solution as multi-cloud security compliance scanning at the end of February. We used March as a validation period where it wasn't authoritative yet, and the previous tools still ran side by side. It allowed us to identify together with the various lines of businesses where we found initial issues. And then from the start of Q2, we Chef spec or the solution based around that became the authoritative tool for security compliance scanning in the entire company. So by now we're about through the first 6 months of that, which is really quite fantastic. And what we really want to talk about today is how that went, like the sort of benefits that we got from that operationally, like when you actually run it, because that's been in some cases confirmed a lot of stuff, but in some cases also helped us do things that we didn't think were going to happen at all. So we had a bunch of expectations to begin with, because otherwise why do it in the first place? And the first one was really like, how could we make sure that we could handle the growth in the landscape, at least in a way that we had some level of control over, right? It's one thing to have a commercial solution as SaaS, where you may have to negotiate that, and there's like the vendor has to think about how they project their costs, and obviously needs to make a little bit of money as well. So taking that into your own hands, it gives us at least the possibility to do something about that without being essentially victim in some way. And this is not a trivial requirement. It's also not necessarily that we expect vendors to easily deal with this. Like it's a very large environment. We recently deployed another tool and ran into some onboarding issues on one of the cloud providers because we hit some other API rate limit. So this is a challenge everywhere, but being able to manage that challenge ourselves is ultimately maybe more comfortable than having to wait for somebody else to fix something, right? And given our experience that we had with prior vendors, that was a very high desire to have that more direct control. That also extended into what was being scanned for. There's the policy that we have is somewhat unique. You can say like much of that aligns with CIS benchmarks, but they're not quite the same. And there's some unique variations, and not all the tools have the capabilities to cover the entire policy. And that was indeed the case, where there were whole segments of the policy that we just couldn't scan for because there was no way for the tool to do that. And we also understand that not every vendor can accommodate our special requirements. Maybe you can do that at the start of a sale, but once you're already in, so like, hey, can you support another platform? That would be very uncomfortable and probably lead to having to renegotiate something. And if you have the ability to do a lot of that yourselves, working with the organization, working with the open source project process, that it gives you opportunities that we have to take into account. You know, there's always the chance that SAP decides that some other cloud provider might come in. It's not in the table as far as I know. I know nothing. But it is a possibility that we have to take into account. And what do you do if that cloud provider is not supported by the security tool that you've chosen? Another thing that relates to that and that determining of our own destiny is we wanted to be more responsive to the organization. That we in the past had a lot of cases where we had to wait for fixes for several months and had to then explain to the organization, like, okay, that one is currently under review, so don't really worry about that one. And that became really annoying and complex as well in weekly reporting. And this is an important factor because compliance work's not exactly fun, right? Like we do scans and we'd like to enable, but we are very conscious that when you have a bunch of policy violations, that a team needs to make time for that to put that in place, maybe test it through their cycle, make sure that it doesn't break anything, and they'd rather do something else, like we probably all would. So how could we make things easier, allow them to shift left when it comes to security compliance for cloud infrastructure, and make that more accessible? So we had a bunch of organizational benefits and cost benefits, but that's not really the topic of this talk. So I really want to talk about the operational benefits that we saw in the last 6 months, as well as in maybe the lead up to that. Of course, there were things that we expected. So, we had expectations, as I just went over. There were some things that we wouldn't put in a slide deck, but that we talked about among ourselves, or like, it would be cool if that would happen. But often our hopes actually exceeded our expectations. And then there were benefits that we actually did not expect at all. But that was, of course, even more interesting. So the anticipated benefits kind of map a little bit to the expectations that we started off with. So we wanted to cover all the controls in the policy, and we were able to do that. So there's literally a one-for-one mapping. You can read the policy, you can find the control in either our documentation or in our GitHub repository. And not only does that translate directly, it actually makes sure that the fail condition is very clear, because we of course have to express this in code, and that means that that interaction with the policy team means that the clarity of the code of the policy is much more practical. There's not sort of a desire or a wish. It has to be something that you can go, okay, we go scan, and either it comes back good, comes back bad, or comes back skip, because we know that there's an exception for it is in place. Because we release there's now the entire policy set both as a consumer container that teams can run in Docker, either in their CI/CD pipeline or even from their laptop. And there's complete parity between those scans and the post-deployment landscape. So it's not as if there's one tool here, one tool there, and there's a possible mismatch. It's actually the same thing. It's literally the same policy set. And that has, we wanted that to happen, but of course that actually materialized, and it's very, very nice. What it also allowed us to do was higher quality status and executive reporting, because we have all of this in our hand, so we can associate it with all kinds of metadata and distribute that through the organization, essentially at will. You see on the right there the multiple data access channels that we have, through our consumer container so that you can get it yourself, and you can run that as many times as possible. We don't record those results, but the post-deployment results are sent every Monday as a mailer. We share data exports on Thursday for larger central security teams. The compliance mailer goes really to the owners of the cloud accounts and their security officers, but also provide dashboards and API access to make these scan results as accessible as possible. And a lot of that, again, relies on that organizational metadata enrichment. A lot of that, all of that is essentially automated. One of the real neat tricks is the association of the cost center. So who pays for the cloud account and the run costs of that cloud account to the central system in SAP that manages the organizational hierarchy that cost object belongs to. And what that means is that these cost objects may move during because of a team change, name of the team change, or the name of the organization changes, but also we get restructuring on a regular basis. That's just the nature of large organizations. And that means that we don't have to manually maintain that organizational hierarchy. It just self-adjusts in the dashboard. So, you know, sometimes we simply see a change in the dashboard because somebody changed the association of a cost object, and now it can be distributed in a different part of the organization. So that is fantastically useful. The policy clarity is not just in the sense of the clarity between the code and the policy that you have to have, otherwise you can't express it in code. It also is very useful because it can be reviewed by the internal customers. So our GitHub repository is accessible to anyone within the organization. So they can literally look up the control code and see if they believe it does what they think it does. And because it's so clear and precise, they can actually see whether it's an issue with the control code or with the policy itself. And that makes things much clearer. We also had some benefits that we hoped for, and especially this, you know, having this ability to match the code to the policy. That became really helpful in actual operations when people had questions. So like, imagine a ticket comes in and says like, hey, I have a question about this particular control. And we literally can put the code side by side. We can put the policy side by side, and we can triage whether somebody has an issue with the control, and this is maybe a false positive investigation, or whether we're actually debating the policy and somebody disagrees with the policy. So within, you know, seconds, like there was a case of where the developer team had set the number of passwords, minimum password changes before it could repeat to a very high number, and the policy said 15, and the policy checked, the control checked for 15, and the guy's argument was like, but 100 is better. So we realized quickly that the code was doing what the policy said. So we referred them to the policy owner to have a discussion about, hey, can we change that? And now the policy is changed to, you know, higher or equal than 15. So if you want to choose 1,000, knock yourself out, you know, and it will still show up as a pass. So that's been very useful to have that clarity even directly in the interaction with the teams. A whole separate section could be done on exceptions, and I actually considered a slide, but for that specifically. But by handling exceptions at the source, we have a process in place where it's kind of convoluted, but it means that there's an actual process that can result in an approved exception for your cloud account or a particular issue that we can put in the skip mechanism for Chef Inspect, which means that it's even skipped at scan, which means that the entire downstream, we don't have to really worry about whether an exception is applied during the reporting pipeline or anything like that. It's basically already done at source, and especially when you have these multiple um, uh, distribution channel, it's very useful that you don't have to deal with that individual downstream. What was also interesting is that our policies have become smarter. This is not just a question of that interaction of like, is the policy practical and can it be scanned for and does it have the right failure condition? Is that because of the interaction we have with the line of business, we understand much more of how landscapes are deployed within SAP. And because it's a very large organization, a lot of teams do it a little bit differently. A lot of teams are in different stages of maturity. We can't expect the same thing of somebody in a marketing department trying to keep a website up versus a fully supported platform team that has hundreds of developers and a very structured process. So being able to interact with the rest of the organization has led to changes in policies that are aware of how SAP is being run. And I would actually say that the vast majority of the policy changes these days are in this category. So it's the landscape that can drive the policy change, not just the teams themselves, but also, of course, changes in whether a service is being retired or changed and updated. And having this constant engagement with the teams on what they're using, what they're doing, and also the challenges that they face has an impact on the policy itself, which is a really nice sort of evolution of getting smarter rather than just state a policy and expect everybody to meet that. The community engagement has been enormously important. We had a March validation period in the first month of operations. That was very intensive, and it started off real good with, the first false positive report was fixed within 20 hours or so. And that really encouraged the rest of the organization to come out and report theirs when they hadn't experienced that. Previously you reported a false positive and it could take several weeks. So that was a really good way to get that started. And we have this interaction through our weekly office hours to make that really happen, as well as team-specific briefings and follow-up where necessary. And this is actually kind of bit magical. I find this really magical. So there's the diagram kind of implies that there's conversations happening outside of it, but the area in blue is what I would consider is really the central point of our office hours. So this is every Tuesday. We do sessions, one in the morning for me and Pacific time zone, but it's afternoon in Europe and a bit late in Asia. And then we do it again in the late afternoon, US West and early risers in Asia. What is remarkable is that this call was started in 2019, and it's not something that people have to go to, but people come to because it actually helps them with their remediation efforts and have a direct contact with the team. And we regularly get over 50 attendees and sometimes like well over 100, which is quite remarkable for a call that's really about security compliance and, your boss doesn't necessarily forces you to go to. Obviously, we try to be like, welcoming and pleasant. We have a fantastic host that keeps us all engaged. And what we really try to do is encourage and praise the successes and encourage where there might still be some challenges. Like empathy is a big part of that, and bringing everybody together really accelerates that process. We from the Devops team and the security policy team inform everybody in advance of any changes in policies and controls that impact the landscape, and justify and explain why these changes were made. And teams can ask questions and provide feedback on these changes, but also ask any kind of things like, hey, I have this thing, I have this alert, do I need an exception for that because this is really business critical? And we can have a debate whether or not that might be warranted. You have other teams on that can say whether they are facing the same problem, so you can suddenly discuss whether or not there should be a policy change or whether somebody needs to go through an exception process. And that leads to a very quick cycle of both fixes of any false positives, because that's really where the relationship often starts. And another aspect is this really interesting interplay between security risk and the operational burden that you put on the teams, right? Just declaring like, this is what we're going to do. And then, teams go like, well, that's nice that you want that, but that would require like a massive amount of effort. Is there a way that we can do that maybe as a central control, or can we roll that out in a maybe more careful way? And as a result, again, we've become far more intelligent and responsive by bringing the teams in. So it's not, there's always this really good interplay. And as a result, this is getting into the benefits we did not expect, is that policy and the controls have a ridiculously high velocity of change. We are now on a 2-week release cycle. We found early on when we released every 4 weeks that when we had fixes, we had them in the pipeline, but then teams for 2, 3, 4 weeks in a row would say like, well, I thought you said these were fixed, but I still find them in my alerts. And that was, of course, uncomfortable for everybody. So we accelerated the release cycle to every 2 weeks. We actually considered doing it every week. But then you get like, okay, this is the impact from the previous change, and here's the impact of the coming change that spins everybody's heads. So we settled on a 2-week cycle. And again, Justin Rohead will talk more about the practicality of how that works. But that means that like 1 week, we explain what the impact was of the controls that were deployed. And the following week, we announced the impact of the next week changes. And you'd think that this high velocity of policy changes, if you think of this sort of objectively, like how can you have policies that change every 2 weeks? How can we expect people to adhere to that? But it's actually a good thing because the whole community is involved with that. And it's not resisted, it's in many cases, it's welcomed, because many of these changes are in response to things that the community themselves brought to us, which really goes into that user acceptance and enablement and partnerships to get us all together. For instance, one of the things that we added in, because we lost this by moving away from the previous tools, is we added remediations in the control code, both as a tag, so it's actually included in the control, and is visible through our GitHub pages, which both gives Terraform examples as well as console remediations. Initially, we resisted that, but the organization is at the stage where a lot of teams really needed that. So that was put together by the team in almost record time. And what's been really cool is I was in a meeting a couple of months ago, not entirely sure why I was invited, where one of the main business unit central security teams, asked the security organization whether they could do other policy areas like we were doing in partnership with Multicloud. And of course, that's maybe the biggest compliment that you could possibly get. We also have like more meaningful metrics, but I see that we're running a touch out of time, and I really want to touch on this piece because this is maybe like operational more inside of the team rather than external facing, and that is we really feel that we refined our SecDevOps approach and methodology. This has been really interesting. The team was already called SecDevOps when I came in with an idea of, it's a DevOps way of doing security operations. But through the process of building out the solution, going ourselves through the full DevOps lifecycle with the solution, doing everything as code, operate and monitor the solution, see the impact of that with not just our key stakeholders, maybe in a sprint demo, but with the community every week of those that are affected by the scans that we provide, has been really fantastic. It allowed us to move fast, iterate fast, and as you see, even our policies now change at the rate of speed of the cloud and reactive to the organization. What was fascinating is that only earlier this year did I come across this white paper by two guys in Google Security, Autonomic Security Operations, 10x transformation of the Security Operations Center. And as I was reading that, I came across a couple of paragraphs that basically described what we were doing. And that was one of those moments where you go like, what? That's what we do. I want to quickly touch on a few things to watch out for. It does require a team. We grew from 5 to 23 team members today, and that's not all dedicated to the Minerva, that's our internal name, Multicloud security scanning solution based on Chef and Spec, because we also cover other areas. But it does require a few people to do this at this scale, keep it running, and be as responsive with the organization and the security teams. It does require a lot of close partnerships, and we were very lucky to have executive sponsorship, both from within the cloud, global cloud services operations leadership, and the security leadership, as well as executive board support. That always helped, and we certainly exploited that to the hilt as well. Another thing, though, to care for is that when we switched over, we dramatically increased the number of alerts that we have, tripled essentially. That was inevitable because a lot of the there were new controls that we previously didn't even have scans for. And it is difficult to explain to the organization, like, we were doing so good, why do we suddenly have this much? So you have to do a lot of work again on that enablement and explaining. And as a result, we've been like extremely transparent in everything that we do. And attitude matters, right? It's really important that you praise those who do well and encourage those that are having more trouble. Maybe take them to the side and see if we can give them some tips, rather than, wag your finger and say like, oh, nobody wants a report card, right? Like, this is really about like getting everybody to work better and shift left. Nothing would make us happier than the entire landscape coming back with passes, and luckily the dramatically vast majority of the scans luckily do. I want to just quickly point out that there were challenges, but I'm handing those over for Justin and Rohit to talk about, not because I want to avoid them, but largely because they can talk about them much better and have a fascinating set of cases to go through. And then I would just like to thank the Multicloud Sec Devops team. This includes some that have since moved on, but have been critical in making all of this happen, as well as all of the team that is currently there. Also in the bottom there are our partners from the Security Policy Organization that have made this work, and not just, you know, build out a fantastically well-working compliance scanning solution for the company, but in some way have sort of defined and refined a model that we will hope to, spread further through the organization as much as possible. And with that, thank you all so much for spending time with me. And if you'd like to get in touch, LinkedIn is a good way. Twitter is also a good way. And hope to hear your questions.
Thanks very much, Jay. I'm always impressed by what you and the team are doing at SAP, the size, the scale, the growth rates, and I know, having worked with SAP as a partner over a number of years for various companies, I know who your customers are, and therefore just what the impact on our day-to-day lives of what you're supporting and enabling is, even if we may not always realize it. So thank you very much for taking the time to share all of that with us, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Have a great conference, everybody.